This is Deborah Zaritsky for Bio 520, Grand Canyon University. Today is June 3rd, 2020 for Dr. Adakos. Today we're talking about how respiration is controlled. One would think that respiration is controlled in the lungs and in the brain, which is a true statement. One would say, is breathing and respiration a voluntary action or an involuntary action? Well, when we look at a mid-sagittal section of the brain and we see all of our anatomical parts, we know that the spinal cord and the brain make up the central nervous system, and all of the nerves that stem out is called the peripheral nervous system. So then we get a little bit more divided into something called a parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So we know that the cerebral cortex is for the majority of our voluntary actions, such as motor control and skeletal muscle. So we know that the cerebral cortex is going to send impulses to the motor neurons in the spinal cord that are going to supply the respiratory muscles. So the respiratory muscles are going to be our skeletal muscles, which are voluntary. So then we have this purple structure here known as the brain stem. And within the brain stem, we're going to have some important game players here. So we've got to get that rhythmic breathing rate, the neural activity done by that autonomic nervous system. So we have the same kind of actions from the pacemaker activity in the heart as we do in the lungs, again coming from the autonomic controls in the brain. So we've got the brain stem, and within that we have the special structure called the pons. We have something called the pontine respiratory group, which is going to go with our dorsal respiratory group and our ventral respiratory group. And that's going to be all-inclusive in a structure or an area called the medullary respiratory center. So this is going to go down to our spinal cord. We have the phrenic nerves that provide motor control of our diaphragm. The diaphragm is going to be the muscle that's going to separate our abdominal cavity from the respiratory area. So we've got that phrenic nerve going to the diaphragm connected to the spinal cord. We've got intercostal nerves to the internal intercostal muscles and the external intercostal muscles, and I'm going to talk about those in just a moment. As we can see here, we have the external, and then we've got the internal. So I kind of think of it as internal is inspiratory or inhaling, and the external intercostal muscles are for also involved in inspiration. So what is it exactly that the medullary respiratory center is responsible for? Well, as I had mentioned, it has these two groups called the dorsal respiratory group and the ventral respiratory group. And this is going to stimulate our inspiratory activity to suit the ventilation needs that we have, such as during exercise or in slower rated breathing, maybe due to like septic shock. We also know that there are many neural bodies that make the output of the respiratory muscles. So the medullary respiratory center is going to receive information from the receptors on temperature, blood gas levels, and the movement of muscles. Again, just to kind of gauge how should our respiration be. We know our respiration is approximately 17 breaths per minute. So how is it that this would increase or slow down, or why? So talking a little bit more about the dorsal respiratory center and the ventral respiratory center, also known as the DRC or DRG for dorsal respiratory group, and then the VRG or VRC for ventral respiratory center or ventral respiratory group. So we have something called a passive expiration and something called an active expiration. So passive expiration is when we just have normal breathing. Active expiration is where we might have a fluctuation in the breathing pattern. And this is due to neurons that are being fired to stimulate the abdominal and internal intercostal motor neurons. And that's going to move the respiratory muscles and the diaphragm. So we know that in the DRG or DRC here that we're going to have descending fibers that terminate on the motor neurons. When the inspiration neurons fire, inspiration occurs, we have inhalation. And when inspiration neurons cease fire, cha-chow, passive expiration occurs. Passive expiration just means that we have normal breathing, where we don't have any extra work in our muscles there. So in regards to our VRG or ventral respiratory center or group, it's both inspiratory and expiratory. So they're both inactive during normal breathing. And we kind of term the VRG as an overdrive mechanism in active expiration, and this might be due to strenuous exercise. So the DRG is going to stimulate the inspiratory activity to suit the ventilation needs, as I just mentioned, based on the body temperature and the other signals from the body. And then, pardon me. And then we're going to have some other areas that mean a lot to us. So there's something called the pre-Butzinger complex. It is in the VGR area of our pons and our brainstem there. And it has synaptic input by producing self-induced action potentials. And according to researchers, analysis of synaptic mechanisms in the preparation that they had done had led to the hypothesis that conditional pacemaker neurons in the medulla are the kernel for rhythm generation. So when I had mentioned that these are similar mechanisms to the heart, this is where that would be controlled in the medulla. Again, those pontine, the area that I had just mentioned before, let's get it back here, right here. So that's going to include our DRG or DRC and our VRG or VRC. So the pontine respiratory group, it has something called the pneumotoxic and apneustic areas. Excuse me for my pronunciation. The pneumotoxic area in the pons makes smooth inspirations and expirations. That gives us this kind of a seamless breathing. And then we have kind of something the opposite, which is called the apneustic center, which is going to prevent inspiratory neurons from being switched off, and that causes abnormal breathing. So when I first heard of the term apneustic, the first thing I thought of was apnea. And apnea occurs when we have a loss of breathing for 1 to 2 seconds. And if this is a moderate apnea, it's not much to be concerned about unless we have some other issues or cardiac issues. So usually doctors will prescribe something called a CPAP or continuous pressure into the airway during sleeping hours. So we have another, it's a reflex, and the reflex is going to be called a Herring-Brauer reflex, and it's going to prevent the overinflation of the lungs with a tidal volume of over 1 liter. So according to Sherwood, pulmonary stretch receptors within the smooth muscle layer of the small airways are activated by stretching of the lungs at large tidal volumes. So these action potentials from these stretch receptors travel through afferent nerve fibers to the medullary center and inhibit the inspiratory neurons. So this is how we breathe. Here are my resources or references. And thank you so much.